want to welcome you to another of our series of History at Your Doorstep. My name is Peter Osborne. I'm the Executive Director of the Menacing Valley Historical Society here in Fort Jervis, and also the City Historian. Over the years, we've done a series of television programs about local history. Tonight, we're going to work on one on the history of cemeteries and graveyards throughout the region. Graveyard is art, and the history of cemeteries is a very interesting topic. I'm sure that after our program, you'll not drive by a cemetery or a graveyard again, especially our local ones, without perhaps stopping or thinking about what you saw in our program. Before we begin, I want to thank Doris Hammond and Sherry Herman for filming this, for Access 8, for showing this on the air tonight. And if you have any thoughts or perhaps would like to see a show on a certain historical topic given, please feel free to contact the station or the Historical Society at 856-2375. So now we'll go to our slideshow on the histories of graveyards and cemeteries in America. It's an example of a communal graveyard. This is known as the Pioneer Graveyard near Godefroy, New York. It is the oldest graveyard in present-day Orange County, also known as a burial ground. There are many of the early settlers buried here, including the Cuddeback families, Gamors, Swordouts, Van Imogens. There's about 100 burials in this very small plot. It's about 165 feet by 185 feet, just a little bit less than an acre. It was originally surrounded by a wooden fence, and most of the stones, as you can see here, are really of primitive quality. Some of them are not even carved with a name, they're just simply bluestone. All of these people were originally the Dutch settlers here, and in fact, Peter Gamor, who donated this graveyard to the church, the Deer Park Reformed Church, owned the farm that surrounded us and donated the land in the 1840s to become a graveyard. We are presently trying to restore this, and we're doing some work up there, inventorying the monuments and also taking pictures and videos of all of the stones there, monuments, so that we'll have a record for the future. There are both 19th and 20th century burials and 17th or 18th century burials, as well. In the case of these old graveyards, the stones are usually set in straight rows. Generally, they're very simple. This kind of a graveyard was often in a part of the farm that was perhaps not as usable, a gravelly knoll perhaps, or an area that just wasn't tillable. They're usually located near a church. In this case, this is not. This was far removed from the church. But if this property, for example, was not well drained, that became an ideal spot for a graveyard. There are sometimes you'll see a few trees in the original layouts of these kinds of things, but for the most part, they're very open and not landscaped in any fashion. These kinds of graveyards were used from the earliest days of the colonial settlements. The burial places in the very early times, now we're talking in the 1690s, very early 1700s in our area, would have been places that would have been actually camouflaged. And that is said to have been done because local settlers did not want Native Americans who might still be in the area or perhaps were from other areas that might have been raiding into the area. They did not want the Native Americans to know how many people perhaps had been killed in a raid. But the most interesting thing I think about graveyards is that all of the burials are done so that the feet of the dead person are facing east, so that on the resurrection morning, all of the bodies will rise to the east as the immortal, as the ending of or the beginning of the next life. You go off to the sign of the rising of the eastern sun. This is something that's not only unique to colonial America, but it's also unique in many Native American burials as well. This idea of looking and rising towards the eastern sun. The other thing is that the inscriptions on the monuments all face west, so that when you stand behind a monument, you're not actually standing on the person, you're actually away from the person. And that's not the case in today's cemeteries. It's very different today. But in that time, that would have been the way that it was done. Often when you go to these kinds of graveyards, you'll see that many people died in a very short period of time. Epidemics, raids, sickness of some sort, and they also are very stark and show this great fear, but also this great reverence for the process of life and death. This is another example of a community graveyard, except that has an interesting history. This is in Warwick on Route 94, in Warwick, New York. It's a typical community burying ground, a public burying ground too, and that is that it was begun in the 1700s near a small community, that is Warwick. And normally community graveyards like this, everyone is very tightly packed in together, and you can see the great variety of monuments. And in this case, this small communal graveyard is actually surrounded by a much larger cemetery that was placed there in the mid-19th century. This particular setting of stones, collection of stones, actually though were moved from the churchyard in the middle of Warwick and moved out here in later years. But the way that these were set up, I'm sure duplicated the way they were actually in the original graveyard and churchyard. But you can see the very interesting designs there, the tops and the engravings and so on, and how tightly packed they are together. This is another example of a communal burial ground. This is more into the 19th century. This is the Hartwood graveyard in Hartwood, New York, town of Forestburg in Sullivan County. Hartwood was made famous by Stephen Crane, the author who wrote The Red Badge of Courage, at least in part of it here in Fort Jervis, and also for his series of sketches called the Sullivan County Tales and Sketches, which were stories about people who lived mainly in Sullivan County and at the Hartwood Club, which is in Forestburg. This cemetery is divided into two sections. The graveyard is actually to the right of the stone wall, and the newer cemetery is outside on the side that we're standing here in the foreground. And I'm not sure that there's a complete inventory of the graveyard because there are some very old mines. They're very early 1800s, some of which are not marked. This is a cemetery that we have visited with local school kids because graveyards are a great place to teach history. Also, graveyard art is an art form, and it's great for genealogy. You can make rubbings at monuments like these. And the big thing, though, is to be careful that people don't lean against monuments or stand on monuments or desecrate monuments. In fact, one year when we were here with the school group, somebody leaned on a tablet and it flipped over and we had to put it back in place. So you have to be careful when you're in these kinds of cemeteries. Oftentimes, graveyards and cemeteries represent a piece of history. And this is a slide of the boundary dispute between New York and New Jersey. The place that we're going to go to in just a moment is the place, if you look at the line, the northern boundary of New Jersey, and it says Station Point at 4140. That is Coshocton, New York, which is about 40 miles north of Fort Jervis on the Delaware River. And the reason that I show this slide is that this particular graveyard is in the middle of a very contested area. In fact, Coshocton and from there to Fort Jervis was part of the New York-New Jersey boundary dispute. We're going to do a program on that in the future, for but in that case, you have East and West Jersey, New York, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania all claiming roughly that area near Station Point. And it's important to know that because when you begin to look at the burials there at this particular cemetery, what you find is families of all of those different areas and militia groups from all those different areas having served here and being buried here. This particular graveyard and cemetery is about an acre big, and it sits, as you can see in the background, right on the banks of the Delaware River, and not too far from the old Erie Railroad. This graveyard has been well preserved, and the people of that area have been very concerned about the preservation of the monuments there and also the names of the people who were buried there. So as you can see, this is a monument that kind of has a listing of all the major families. So you see the Van Zandt family, which is the Dutch family, the Tylers, the Conklin, which is a family here from our area as well, the Avery family. These are all families there in Coshocton that go back quite a ways. And what's really a nice example of is how some of these monuments which are faded away or have been destroyed in time, at least the family names are still remembered there at Coshocton. This is a great example of a family member whose monument apparently was destroyed at some point It sits right on the river, so there's been quite a bit of damage from the floods over the years. But they put this new monument down so that the memory of Ebenezer Taylor would not be lost. As I said, this sits right on the Delaware River, and unfortunately, there at the graveyard and cemetery, very often the ice comes up over the bank and clips these stones off. And so the cemetery association there has placed iron or metal crosses next to the clipped off monuments. This is an interesting monument because it's very typical of very early 19th century and late 18th century monuments. Very simple, rounded top to it. But the ice often has come up over the top of this and done a lot of damage there in the cemetery. So this is another kind of burying ground. We've looked mainly at communal burying grounds up until now, or graveyards. This is a family burying ground. That is to say that there are members only of one family buried here. This is on the Hartwood Club Road in Hartwood in the town of Forestburg, New York. The Handy family was an interesting family. They are one of the first families to come into the town of Forestburg. They come over through Beaver Dam, which is now a road that comes up over near the Pinpack Trail and comes up and over into Sullivan County from there. The dimensions of this are only about 25 feet by 25 feet. There are only several fieldstones with no legible writings on them, and this is obviously near a road, which many of these family graveyards are, and there probably was a farm not too far from here, a Handy farm. This particular graveyard and burial ground has an interesting story because if you look closely at where the historic marker is, there's a little bit of a rise in the ground there, and no one knew that this cemetery existed until a truck was digging into that bank to get some dirt to fill the road in, and they hit a coffin, and they realized that there was a family burial ground, so that it was backfilled, and then the historic marker was placed there in the 1930s. In an older time, this may sound really unusual to us in this time, but it was not unusual to see slabs and monuments rising from the middle of fields in corn, in fields of potatoes, for example, or grain, and foreigners were really amazed at how the American farmers would grow crops right in the middle of their cemeteries and graveyards, and that was quite often done, especially in New England. Families members were often buried together, and the problems became as evident as you might imagine when people were buried on top of each other, and they had huge messes of water and all the mess of decomposed bodies and so on. But in an earlier time, it was not as regulated as it is now, and now there are certain things that you cannot do. You just can't bury your body in the ground anymore, and you have to be buried in a coffin in a crypt of some sort. But that's just how things have changed over the years. These family graveyards are often, even to this day, are very much private, atop a hill or rocky ground that was unfit for cultivation. They're usually on every farm, because at that time Americans owned big farms, and that was the place where they laid their ancestors. It is interesting that today you can still have a family burial ground. It can be no larger than 3 acres, and it can't be any closer than 100 feet next to a house without the owner's permission. That is an adjacent property owner. But you can still have a family burial ground. And there are lots of them around. I often walk in remote areas and you'll see 5 or 6 headstones somewhere, and that's because that was probably a family plot. This is the Carpenter family plot at the very tip in the Low Grove Cemetery. This is unique because the family is buried at a location in which the name was still maintained, that is Carpenter's Point. They ran a ferry across the river nearby, and they were buried at the very tip, just right, almost underneath Route 84. Where it crosses over the Tri-States Rock. Laurel Grove Cemetery was created, and the Carpenters were left there and buried on that really tip of land there. This is a typical family burial ground that you'll find out in the middle of the woods. This just happens to be on Oakland Valley Road in Cutterbackville. Again, very typical. At least one of the families buried here is the Durham family, but they're often today in the middle of woods. and you walk upon these and just find them by accident. There's probably 50 people buried here, and at one time I'm sure it was well maintained by the families that lived there. But of course, those families have since long moved away and are now in other places, and so these often become neglected by the towns or villages or cities that they're located within. Our listeners will be maybe interested to know that if a cemetery or a graveyard is abandoned and there is no legal person or record of a corporation that owns it, corporation record, they have to be taken over by the town, village, or city that they're within. So they can't just be abandoned. The cities or towns or villages are required to maintain them. They have the option of moving them if they want to, moving all the bodies to another cemetery. But this is a real trouble for those of us in the preservation business that want to see these maintained, because so many, oftentimes they're abandoned. We've seen developers just plow things like this over, just take the stones out altogether. It's happened to at least once over in Greenville, where a farmer plowed over an entire field with the monuments in it. So it's a big problem. Sometimes family cemeteries, however, are much, well, for one thing, are currently used and are much more elaborate. This is the Holbert Cemetery in Lackawaxen, Pennsylvania. This is a mid-19th century, late 19th century family cemetery, and as you can see, it's a very attractive, typical of the planned cemeteries of the 19th century, except in this case it's exclusively for Holbert family members. It is attractive, very well maintained, and landscaped, still open for burials, and the gateway that you see there, which is, I think, just marvelous, is a symbol of transition. That is a departure of an individual from this life as reward to the next life. Often in these family cemeteries there will be a very large obelisk in the middle of the cemetery. In this case we have, as you can see near the bottom, it says Holbert, and an obelisk is that shape that you see with a point on the top of it. And these are very, like for example, the Blair Cemetery in Blairstown, New Jersey. There is a very large Blair monument. So that's very common in these kinds of cemeteries. And all the little monuments around it are often people that were connected to maybe the main family member who came here perhaps, or was the first family member into the area. So you've seen a little bit of family yards, graveyards, communal graveyards. We now come to a different topic of graveyards. These are church graveyards. This is the Mehekamec graveyard on East Main Street in Port Jervis. Many of you probably drive by this every day. This is what I believe to be the second oldest cemetery in western Orange County. It may be the oldest cemetery in Orange County. And originally, the church, the Deer Park Reformed Church, the predecessor church, was located right across the street, roughly where the Senior Citizen Housing Center is now. This is probably about 200 feet by 200 feet. The stones, for the most part, are of a very primitive quality, but there were people buried here until the early years of the 19th century. It too, like the Pioneer Knoll Cemetery that I showed you, the graveyard earlier, was deeded to the Reformed Church. This graveyard has had a terrific problem with lack of maintenance, and it goes back not to just recent times, but we have newspaper articles from the 1890s complaining about the fact that this cemetery and graveyard was not maintained. There are some very large oak trees in the back corner of this property that may be back to the original time that the graveyard was created. It's unfortunate because this is really a very important graveyard and very historic graveyard in our area. This is another example of a church graveyard. This is the Bevins Community Meeting House in Peters Valley, New Jersey, which is about 10 or 15 miles south of Port Jervis on the Old Line Road. This is inside the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area. In this case, many of Sussex County's founding families are buried here. There is an excellent collection of early to mid-19th century stones here, and apparently, for some reason, in this particular graveyard, churchyard, there were a lot of Masons, that is, men of the Masonic order, buried here. Very well maintained by the church or the Cemetery Association, and they have even newer monuments there as well that are quite modern and blend in quite well with the older monuments. This is very typical, this building and where this graveyard is very typical of the churches and houses of worship in the early years of our nation's history. At that time, churches, unlike today, were primarily public buildings. Not only did they have religious gatherings often there, but there were meeting places as well. And what you find in almost all the churches, and it's no different here in Port Jervis, the earliest churches in particular, is the roads tend to radiate out from the churches because they were at the center of the political, religious, and social interaction. They're usually devoid of any kind of landscaping treatment. There's very few plantings. There might be a tree occasionally. But for the most part, these are very plain and simple places. In fact, somebody complained in one letter about the fact that the local minister let his cows and goats wander through the local graveyard to keep the grass down. Most of these kinds of graveyards, however, are associated with churches, and sometimes the denominations have changed, and so you'll see what was originally an old Protestant graveyard now becoming a Catholic cemetery because the church has changed or the denominations have changed. There are some interesting traditions about church graveyards, especially the farther back that you go. For example, in the European churches, there was especially a practice of burying people underneath the church, in the dirt underneath the church. Some people, even in dirt floors, were buried underneath their pews, and sometimes ministers were buried underneath the pulpit. And you might well imagine that could be a major problem for ventilation, for heat. When the churches began to smell from that, it was very controversial to practice, and in fact, it was mainly done in New England and not here. My favorite story about people being buried underneath churches concerns John Adams and John Quincy Adams, the only father and son duet to be president of the United States. And the church that they are buried under is the Unitarian Church in Quincy, Massachusetts. This is John Quincy Adams' original burial place. There was a vault created, as you can see, J.Q. Adams on it. But eventually he was buried along with his father and their two wives underneath the building behind you. And it's a great story. We were there a few years ago. This fine man gave us a tour. My wife, Janice, decided that she didn't want to go into the church and bother anybody, but I was really anxious to see this because I had read about it. And so she was out smoking a cigarette, and finally I said to her, "You got to come in and see this because it's really interesting." And in the basement of that church are 4 very large granite crypts. And this man is the official caretaker of the crypts for the church, and to some degree the official historian as well. But John Adams, Abigail Adams, his wife, John Quincy Adams, and her name doesn't come to me right at the moment, I want to say Catherine Adams, are all buried in these crypts. And they are all of equal size. They are enormous. They're beautiful. It is the closest that I have ever been to a president, being able to stand right on the crypt like that, or stand next to the crypt like that. But my favorite story about this is that on top of the monuments, behind these monuments, there's a plaque for each person. Of course, John Adams was the second president, an important figure in Revolutionary War history. His wife, Abigail Adams, some of you may recall that one of the things that she said before John Adams went off to get the Constitution written, said, "Please don't forget the women in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and all of our early country's documents," which he promptly did. There's John Quincy Adams, who was later a president. And then his wife, John Quincy Adams' wife, is the only first lady to have been a British citizen, the only non-American first lady, citizen, I should say. And on top of her plaque, there are these very, very glowing plaques about how John Adams was this and John Quincy was that and Abigail was this. On top of his wife, John Quincy's wife's, is this, because of course she was not a non-American citizen originally, there is this wonderful plaque that says she really tried her best, if you want to paraphrase it in the right way. How John Quincy Adams came to be buried here is a fascinating story. Some of you may recall, after he was president, he was elected once again to the House of Representatives. And so, in being elected, he was on the House floor, and I want to say around 1826, or somewhere thereabouts, 24, he died while giving a speech on the floor of the House. The original plan was to bury him there in Washington, the family decided no, that they wanted him to come back to Quincy, Massachusetts. And so his funeral, the main services were held there in Washington, and as a result, his coffin had a glass lid put over the top of it so that he could be viewed by literally hundreds and hundreds of people there. The coffin was covered, brought back home. All four of these crypts had been previously cut, so they're all identical in size and style and material. And when the workmen brought his coffin in, they took the lid of his crypt off with the thought that they would just place the coffin in there. And when they took the lid off, they realized the coffin wouldn't fit into the crypt. It was about an inch too big. So they tried to jock it in, they tried to get it in at all right angles, and they couldn't. So they decided to try, and they weren't going to tell anybody this is just two regular workmen. They decided that they would take the lid of the coffin off and just put his body in the crypt. And they figured that nobody would ever know, so it wouldn't make a difference. So they took the lid of the coffin off, and of course there's this glass plate on top of it, and it's a very cold, dark, damp place. And now this has come from Washington, D.C. by a wagon. They take the top off, and as soon as they took the top off, the glass on top of the coffin completely clouded over. Scared them to death. So they cut the crypt, and they made it an inch longer, and the inside, they hollowed it out, and so John Quincy Adams is buried in his coffin inside that crypt at Quincy, Massachusetts. One of the great stories of it, people being buried underneath churches. Today we wouldn't see it this way, but in an earlier time, churchyards and graveyards were a place to wander or picnic between church services. And people often read the warnings from the dead to the living about how they should take care of their lives and do the right thing. Often symbols of heavenly promise are on these kinds of monuments and these kinds of graveyards, and they were really reminders to the living that that's where they would wind up, in that yawning grave at some point in the future. Sometimes, as I said before, a shade tree, and also the sexton would often let their cows wander through these. This particular monument here is for the Minnesing Church on the Old Mine Road in Montague, New Jersey. It was one of the oldest churches in our area, no longer there. It is only commemorated, that church and its congregation, by this particular monument. And around it are a few stones which must have been probably a fascinating cemetery in earlier time. There must have been a lot of burials. This is a monument that's right next to that monument. There must have been a lot of burials there, but there are only a handful of stones still left there. Another side to these churchyards is that when churchyards and burial grounds became full, there was an effort then to think about creating other kinds of cemeteries. What happened, for the most part, and Port Jervis is a great example of this, is that large pieces of tracts of land within the city limits were then designated to become cemeteries. In this case, St. Mary's is a good example of that. But in some of the New England church graveyards, the land was so precious in these more urbane settings, the villages and towns, that they simply brought in 8 feet of dirt and put them right on top of the old cemetery, and then started new burials all over again, and left the monuments and the graves below them in place. But cemeteries became, especially religious cemeteries, became very popular when doctors began to talk about the issues of water tables, diseases, and so on that could be passed from the people that were buried in some of those cemeteries. For example, I think it's smallpox that you can still get from a person who had it if they're buried in a cemetery and uncover their body. So that became a problem as you come into the 19th century. This is you just saw a picture of St. Mary's. It was created in the 1870s in Port Jervis. And it's typical of that new trend in the 19th century in which a cemetery was associated with a specific church in a plot of land that sometimes was not adjacent to a church. It's designed as a graveyard with unique kinds of plantings and a road system. In the case of St. Mary's and in this particular church here, this is the Catholic cemetery in Holmesdale, they were very restrictive. You had to be Catholic to be buried there. You could not be a criminal, or you could not have committed suicide. You couldn't be buried in a Catholic cemetery. In the case of the cemetery in Port Jervis, St. Mary's Cemetery, some of the bodies that are there now were brought in from another cemetery that was out near present-day Route 6 when they consolidated and changed and created that new Catholic cemetery. This is the Catholic cemetery, as I said, in Honesdale. Catholic cemeteries are often the location of wonderful and impressive graveyard art. And this is a children's memorial there. You can see there are, it's a memory of 400 children of St. Mary Magdalene Parish buried in that particular plot there in Honesdale. And this is the memorial that's above that. These are works of art. And unfortunately, things like this are always the first things to be vandalized. You can see here the left arm, or the angel's right arm, has been broken off, and often the wings have been broken and things like that. But these are really amazing works of art. This was carved out of marble, and it's in 3D. This is another example of a religious cemetery. This is the Jewish cemetery on North Orange Street here in Port Jervis. Most of the wording is in Yiddish. They are very tall, uniquely stylized monuments. I've never seen monuments like these. There's about 20 or 30 of these, placed closely together. And often graveyards and cemeteries tell us a lot about history. And in this case, what it shows is that there has always been, at least since the mid-19th century, a very small Jewish population in Port Jervis. And there are not that many graves here, whereas in Laurel Grove Cemetery there are thousands of people buried. There's not anywhere near that number here. Unfortunately, many of you recall, this cemetery was badly vandalized not too many years ago. The damage was in the tens of thousands of dollars, which was really unfortunate because some of these monuments are very unique and I'm sure not easily found to be not easily repaired. Jewish cemeteries and people of the Jewish faith have a really great tradition. I really like this tradition. You see it all the time when you go to cemeteries like this. If you look at the very top of the monument that's in the foreground, you'll see some little pebbles on the top of it. And people who visit those graves often leave a pebble or a rock or a stone as a sign that they have been there to visit their relatives. And that's a wonderful tradition. Unfortunately, what happens is that the caretakers brush these off every time they cut the grass or clean the cemetery, thinking that they're some kind of a litter, but they're actually a very kind tradition that's been passed down through the centuries. There are other kinds of religious cemeteries. There's the Moravians. All of their monuments are laid flat, equal size. That's to show that man is equal in the eyes of God. Those stones are referred to as breaststones when they're flat in the ground like that. The cemeteries are laid out like graph paper, square, no family plots. In fact, many times Moravian cemeteries are only numbered. There are no names at all. Sometimes they're organized by category, young children married or sexes, or something of that sort. The Shakers also use markers of the same size, equidistant, and they are neat as the Shakers were in their dress and in terms of their construction of furniture and their lifestyles. In fact, some Shaker cemeteries only have one general stone commemorating the dead. The Amish have an interesting tradition of every spring going out, filling in the sunken spots, mowing and rutting all the stones, though their custom is not to visit their cemeteries regularly. They maintain them really well. Up until now, we've basically talked about graveyards, though to some degree cemeteries as well, but the use of the word cemetery did not become widespread until 1797. That's when the word was used for the first time, and it means dormitory, or when we expand that, sleeping chambers used for the dead. It is a very important development. Our area has two very early cemeteries that were designed by well-known landscape architects. It may sound interesting to you, but it was a major development in the burial of the dead. Up until now, it tended to be, just as this picture shows, a church with a graveyard next to it, and it was a very straight-laced process for religious, spiritual process. What you find is As you come into the 1820s, there are several men in Cambridge, Massachusetts, led by a Dr. Jacob Bigelow, who want to design a new burial place. It's laid out in 1831, and it is, in terms of history, a great breakthrough in cemetery design. It is when it is designed, the Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, and opened in 1831, there is not another cemetery like it in our country. In fact, it was quite like a park. As you can see in this picture here, meandering walks that had romantic names. They blended with the contour of the land. At the highest point, or mount, a tower was often constructed for visitors to view the countryside. There became a belief in our country that death was not final, but rather a circle, a part of a larger circle of creation and destruction. Here in our area, there is such a cemetery, the Laurel Grove Cemetery. But let me just go back for a moment and just talk a little bit about some of the other features of these cemeteries. There were large mausoleums built into slopes instead of laying flat in the ground. It was the first time that mausoleums were being used regularly. Often there were ponds associated with these new cemeteries, beautifully planted with trees, even as you can see here. And Mount Auburn Cemetery very quickly became a major attraction. People visited on Sundays. They brought their horses, they brought their families, they had lunch. And it gained momentum around the world, and very soon on, some of America's most famous architects were designing cemeteries. For example, Andrew Jackson Downing, who was from Newburgh, designs Central Park, and has also designed a number of cemeteries. Calvert Vaux, very much involved with the design of these kinds of cemeteries, including the one in Middletown. It is also a time, not only did the graveyards begin to be designed like this, but also at a time in American history when the park movement began. That is the effort to create park spaces within major cities and large towns, and it's a movement that will continue until the advent of World War I. They become known as rural cemeteries, and as I said before, become very popular for outings on Sunday afternoon. Often public transportation went out to these places. In fact, in Fort Jervis, the Laurel Grove Cemetery, the trolley ends right at the entrance to Laurel Grove, or ended, I should say, at the entrance to Laurel Grove Cemetery. They are natural, they're beautiful, there's ornamental trees used, and there is, as it's called in that time, sweetness and repose, and a real-life poetry. We come then to our own Laurel Grove Cemetery, and this cemetery also has a bit of history to it above and beyond the Carpenter's family's involvement. It is, Laurel Grove is 35 acres. There are 15,000 people buried there. It was opened in July 1856 under the leadership of John Conklin. The design of the cemetery was declared to have been consulted with propriety, beauty, and utility. But it has a long history. It is the place where the New York-New Jersey boundary dispute was resolved. And this rock right here was placed there to show where the three states of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania meet. The actual meeting place is farther in the river, and this point of land has been somewhat eroded over the years because it's limestone. But that is at least the spot where the three states were said to have joined. There is still a monument there from the 1882 measuring of the line, and as you can see, Route 84 goes over directly above it. It is the meeting place of the never-sinking Delaware Rivers, and it is also the spot where Carpenter's Ferry was. When the cemetery was opened in 1856, the speakers of the dedication declared it to be the most beautiful cemetery in Orange County. It was the creation of Howard Daniels, whom assisted by D.F. Hathaway. Mr. Hathaway also designed the Warwick Cemetery that we saw earlier, and there were a series of rules created that restricted dogs and horses on the ground. You couldn't go any faster than a certain speed limit. You couldn't leave your garbage there, and the roads were lined with hemlocks. Laurel has its name, Laurel Grove, rhododendron, and it was described as a place of loveliness and scenery. The stones in this monument and in the cemetery, no longer face east and west like the old churchyards and graveyards, but rather now they face the roadside. And there is no effort to put these in any certain fashion. There's just this kind of wandering, meandering feeling throughout Laurel Grove. And if you were a faithful watcher of Access 8 television, you will remember that we did a program there walking through the cemetery in the last year or two. These are some of the monuments. As you can see, some face you would name, some do not. The whole idea, this notion of east and west orientation totally is ended with the use of cemeteries. And this was a very, actually it still is a very beautiful piece of property, very pretty to drive through or walk through. And there are several thousand monuments there, and all of the major styles from the 1850s up until the present are represented there. One of the typical features of these cemeteries was the fact that they had large burial vaults, or receiving vaults. Now this may not be something you might normally think about, but in an earlier time, you couldn't dig into the ground when you go back 100 years before the creation of this particular cemetery. So what they often did was buried coffins underneath piles of hay and dirt, and then would bury the bodies in the spring. And so there would be 15 or 20 coffins, perhaps, underneath this pile of hay and dirt, and then it would be opened in the spring, and that would be it. Well, with cemeteries, they began to use these large burial vaults. This is the one at the Laurel Grove Cemetery. This is in Holmesdale, and this is a really rather attractive one. Steel doors. You can see the sign of the cross over the doors, and there's a vent on top there, and that's where the bodies were kept until the springtime. There were other rural cemeteries as well. The Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia, 1836. Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, for those of you who are from New York City, 1838. The Allegheny in Pittsburgh in 1844. What begins to happen is that these associations, like the Laurel Grove Cemetery Association Incorporated, are created, buy land, lay out these drives, sold lots, created endowment funds for the preservation and maintenance of these particular facilities. After Laurel Grove, I suppose that this is actually, for people who live in the county, this is probably Orange County's most important cemetery. Not because of who was buried here, but rather because of who it was designed by. The Hillside Cemetery Association was formed in 1860. They purchased 36 acres on Mulberry Street in Middletown, and it was George Houston's farm. And it was developed into a cemetery, dedicated in 1861. First burial that year, Theophilus Vale, the first person to be buried there. Middletown's most prominent citizens are now here. Up until this point, there have been no roads or no trees. All of that was done with the design of this. In 1862, there were then 2 miles of roads, carriage roads, a mile of footpaths, and there were 550 lots surveyed, and 2,000 trees and shrubs were planted there. It's important because it was designed by Calvert Vaux. Calvert Vaux, who lived from 1824 to 1895, was a partner with Mr. Olmsted, and they were known for their cemeteries, and their parts of their design were known for their rolling hills and winding roads. He is one of America's premier architects and planners who set the standards for public parks in America. He and Frederick Olmsted designed Central Park in New York City, Prospect Park in Brooklyn, also the Downing Park in Newburgh, and Academy Park in Middletown. So they very much have a presence here in this area, in Orange County, but also across the country as well. They utilize this very English, picturesque manner of the houses and parks and gardens. He wrote a book called Villas and Cottages, which was a guide to successful house building in the mid-19th century. He was born and trained in London, encouraged to come to America by Andrew Jackson Downing, who was then the country's leading landscape designer. He was involved with Frederick Winters, also from England, and they maintained an office in Newburgh from 1850 to 56 when he went on to New York City. Some of the rules of the cemetery might interest you, and Laurel Grove had similar rules to this. For example, they opened at 7 a.m. and closed at sunset. Only the proprietors of lots or families were allowed into the cemetery on Sunday. You could not drive faster than 4 miles per hour. Horses could not be left unattended. Firearms were not allowed, and there were very severe warnings against damage to plants and stones by animals. There was a $25 reward. Now this is in the 1860s. A $25 reward for those who gave information to prosecute those who had done damage. The plots at that time went for between anywhere $8 to $30 a piece in the 1860s. There are now efforts to restore the cemetery. Louis Mills has been involved in this since the late 1980s, and they have raised tens of thousands of dollars to fix the road, restore the pond, fences to be erected, and some of the trees to be restored to their original condition. Sometimes cemeteries can be as simple as a place for one. This is the final resting place of the Jewish peddler. It's on Chapin Road in the town of Lumberland. This is now the property of Orange and Rockland. Interesting because of this very unique wall around it. Some say that he was simply a poor peddler who went from place to place, died here, and was buried here simply. But he apparently was popular and well-loved, and his monument is well-carved and written in Yiddish, and someday we need to have somebody translate that for us, because perhaps there will be more history of his life on that monument. We come to a category of unusual cemeteries. A brief lesson on the D&H Canal operated from 1828 to 1898, and as you might imagine, there were hundreds of people, thousands of people who worked on the canal, thousands of mules who traveled along the canal, people who built the canal in particular. Very perilous job, the kind of a job where you might get blown up by dynamite, killed by rock crushes, dropping of rocks, all kinds of problems. And so what we have is burial grounds along the D&H Canal. This is the one at Montauk, just off of Route 97. You can see the Delaware River out to your right, and you can see just a little smattering of stones there, little monuments, boulders, fieldstones cut in half, dropped in the ground, and we think that there were both people and mules buried there. Remember, this is a time when there are swamps, fevers, very little medicine is available, dynamite blasting. All along the canal there were dangers of quicksand and just the general dangers of the job. And many of these men were people who had come from other parts of the world, like Ireland, had come here, and no one knew where to bury them, so they were buried in anonymous places like this. You may not know this, but as Dr. Frank Simpson tells me, mules can walk and sleep at the same time. Something like some of my friends as well. But at any rate, they were often guided by kids, like this little youngster here, and if the mules were sleeping and walking, and the child was not guiding the mules, they would drop into the canal. The canal is 6 feet deep, and of course they always rescued the mules first because the mules were worth more than, of course, kids were. At any rate, sometimes the mules didn't make it. And so there were places where they buried mules by the hundreds. I remember about 15 years ago when I was asked by the people who owned the C&D Power Systems, they had heard that there was a mule burying ground where they wanted to build their parking lot. And indeed, there is a mule burying ground there off to the left of the building, where the new parking area is. I suspect that there are hundreds of mules buried there. And mules were like pets to these people in the canal. Often had names and were treated like members of the family. At any rate, as I often drive by this at night, I think to myself, there are probably these hundreds of mule ghosts howling around over the top of that parking lot, wondering what's above them in the blacktop. One of the, I think, the most interesting set of cemeteries are often the military cemeteries. They are always moving in sad places because you come very quickly to the realization that they are there because our country has needed people in certain times, and men and women have given their lives in the service of this country. The cemetery at West Point is a great example of that. This is the chapel, and I would highly encourage you to go to the cemetery at West Point. It's right at near the entrance of the grounds of the post. It is the only burial ground where soldiers of all of America's wars are buried. There are 15 Medal of Honors winners there. It's outside of Arlington National Cemetery in Washington. It has the most distinguished collection of military people in the United States in one spot. Going through it is like walking through the pages of history. Just some of the people who are buried there, the more well-known people. David Marcus, 1924, the founder of the modern Israeli army. James Gavin, who led the D-Day invasion at Normandy with the 82nd Airborne. George Armstrong Custer of Custer's Last Stand. Winfield Scott, the hero of the War of 1812 and the commander of the beginning of the Civil War for the Union. Robert Anderson, the commander of Fort Sumter. Edward White, the first American to walk in space, who would later die in the Apollo fire. Daniel Butterfield, the composer of Taps, and Dennis Mitchie, the First Army football coach, are all buried there. One of the earliest military cemeteries in our area after the one at West Point has an interesting history to it, long history. This is the Battle of Minisink marker near Minisink Ford, New York, where the battle took place, as you can see, in July of 1779. The battle has a story that has very much of an impact on the Fort Jervis area. Of course, they came through in the summer of 1778 and again in the summer of 1779. That is, Mohawks and Joseph Brant and his Tory allies came through, and in July of 1779 burned Fort Decker down, burned a number of buildings down, and went back towards up the Delaware River, heading back towards their headquarters in Niagara Falls, New York, on the Canadian side. The American militia units were called out the day of the raid. They all gathered in Fort Jervis, men from Sussex, from Warwick, from Goshen, from Fort Jervis, which was then known as Minisink, and together at a gathering there near the Laurel Grove Cemetery, someone said, we have to take care of this and end these kinds of raids, and against some of the commanders, I think, better wishes, followed Joseph Brant up the Delaware River Valley and met their fate in one of the worst of the Revolutionary War battles in terms of American losses, and met here at Minisink Ford. This particular spot is the last part of the battle when Joseph Brant's raiders had now realized that they had completely surrounded the American militia, that most of them were dead. They came over the tops of these rocks and around from all the sides and then killed the remaining Americans that were there. It was a tremendous loss for the militias and the families of our region. It is one of these stories, though, that just makes you wonder. This happened in 1779. It wasn't until 1822 that there was an effort made to bring the remains back of the people who had been killed there. And while it was a remote area, it was not that remote. There were farms there pretty quickly after the battle. At any rate, the bodies, it was in the 1820s when there was an effort made to bring bodies back to Goshen, where many of these men had been from. And so initially, in 1822 or so, they brought the bones back in a box that they could find there at the battle site and buried them underneath a monument. In 1879, the 100th centennial anniversary of the battle, this monument was erected in Goshen, and more things were added, I think, and then a vault underneath this monument was filled with the bones and now sits underneath this monument. What the scene might have looked like, but that's the first of the local military cemeteries that we have here in our area. And the names of all the men that were killed there are written on this monument. They still occasionally find pieces of guns or equipment up there at the Battleground Park. I've even heard in the last 15 or 20 years of pieces of human skeletons being found. So obviously not everyone was brought back from there. The earliest of our national cemeteries, military cemeteries, has its origin in the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. It was a ferocious battle. Tens of thousands of people killed or wounded. It is what has been called the high watermark of the Southern Confederacy. Several months later, in November, Abraham Lincoln comes to Gettysburg to dedicate a monument and dedicate a cemetery to the men who had been killed there. This is the Orange Blossoms unit. They were men from Fort Jervis, Goshen, Middletown, Newburgh, and this is a Devil's Den. And in fact, the previous slide was also probably an Orange County veteran from Devil's Den. Lincoln dedicates in what was one of the most memorable speeches of all time, Gettysburg Address. That's a picture of him in the center of the photograph with the arrow. He gave a presentation. It was just several minutes long, and it is still one of the great speeches of American history. The man who spoke before him, whose name I cannot remember now, gave a speech I think that lasted at least an hour or 2 hours in length. No one can remember his name, but everybody can remember the Gettysburg Address. It was dedicated, and it was the first national cemetery that was created in our country. Understand that after battles, these armies moved on, and sometimes hundreds of bodies were left there. And I've seen some pictures in the months after the war was over with, where bodies were still out in fields. And so this was when you had battles where sometimes 10 or 15,000 men were killed in a single day. You can imagine what the problems were with burying that many people at one time. One of my favorite military cemeteries and one of my favorite historical events that I personally have interest in is Custer's Last Stand, or the Battle of Little Bighorn in Montana. On June 25th, 1876, just before the nation celebrates its centennial, George Armstrong Custer, pictured here, graduate of West Point, leader of the 7th Cavalry, is outnumbered by what may have been several thousand Native Americans there at the Little Bighorn, and they're completely wiped out in the battle that became known until fairly recently as Custer's Last Stand. The battle was a tremendous loss and a tremendous shock to the American psyche right at that moment, because this is a nation that's getting ready to celebrate 100 years of history. In fact, George Custer believed, or some thought at least, that had he won here, he might have become a nominee for the President of the United States, the presidency. At any rate, there are some people who believe in it, and he's pictured in the center of this slide with his arms going to his right. There are some people, however, who believe that he was killed almost as soon as the battle began. His men came in and swept across and were at the Little Bighorn, the river itself. And some people believe that he was shot almost as the battle began, and then everybody began to pull back and back up to the hill that became known as the Last Stand Hill. There are others, and if you remember growing up with the old Anheuser-Busch calendars that massacred the Little Bighorn there, there's this wonderful picture of him standing alone amongst all of these, this battle, still firing his pistols on. No one's really sure, though, what happened. Everyone was killed there on the military side. It was the single largest gathering of Native Americans, and it was the single greatest Native American victory in their encounters with the whites over the previous 150 years. It never happened again, and it never happened previous to that. The day after the battle, or I guess 2 days after the battle, the rest of his military outfit caught up with him, and it was an awful sight indeed. All of these horses, all of these men, many mutilated, but at any rate, many of the bodies were simply buried right where they lay. Some were given signs. In Custer's case, there was not only was he killed, but several of his family members were killed. Newspaper people were killed there on the top of the hill, or were dead there at least. And signs were put there, wooden crosses and that sort of thing. Within a year, many of the officers were taken back home to their hometowns and buried in their hometowns, and so was with George Custer. It was believed he was brought initially back to Poughkeepsie. He wanted to be buried at West Point. There was some debate for a year as to whether he should be buried at West Point. Many people believed that, of course, he had been responsible for the disaster at the Little Bighorn. A year later, he was brought to West Point, buried next to his wife, who ultimately was buried there, Libby, in this century. She died, and she, of course, kept his memory alive for all those years. In more recent times, there's some thought that George Custer is still buried at the Little Bighorn, and that one of his sergeants, who also had blonde hair and was similar in size and stature, was actually brought home instead, and that Libby Custer is not laying next to her beloved George, but rather next to this sergeant who was on the Little Bighorn. This is his monument at West Point. I have always found this slide to be very interesting because it shows something about George Custer that is amazing. He was a man who, of course, killed buffalo by the hundreds. There's a buffalo there on the side. There are arrows from Native Americans. It's actually, it could equally be a Native American monument as you go around all four sides. And, of course, there's Custer. And this is a man, of course, who was involved there, Custer's last name, but also several terrible encounters with Indians in which Indians were massacred, the Sioux Indians were massacred in the years prior to the Little Bighorn. Just one final story about that. There is now a national cemetery there at the Little Bighorn National Monument in Montana. They're all buried on top of the bodies were eventually gathered of the enlisted men and buried underneath a very large monument there. And nearby is a national cemetery. Captain or Colonel Reno, General Reno was brought back. He was the one who was at the far end of the battlefield, which ranged over several miles, was pinned down there, and was often, in years that followed, blamed for the disaster there, the Little Bighorn. But nearby is a national cemetery where veterans of all many different wars are buried. Reno is buried there. Native Americans called the superintendent of that site a ghost herder because the Native Americans believed that as the superintendent lowered the flag in the evening, the spirits of the dead soldiers rose from the graves and would return the next morning. There are about 4,300 burials there, including some of Custer's Native American scouts. One of the most famous kinds of cemeteries are potter's fields. It was and still is difficult to find resting places for criminals, suicide, strangers, or illegitimate children. They are often called potter's fields. Many times adjoin more established cemeteries. For example, for a long time in Lancaster County, which is where the Amish were, an illegitimate child could not be buried in churchyards, nor could a minister take part in the funeral service or bells tolled in that person's honor. Sometimes, if the churchyards were open to these kinds of burials, the criminals could be buried in unblessed ground. Suicides are often difficult because people are uncomfortable with them, not sure where to bury them. And there's also sites where those with infectious diseases might be buried as well. This Potter's Field in Fort Jervis is right next to the Jewish cemetery. It's on North Orange Street. And you see some of the stones there. These are just pieces of bluestone cut in half. I don't think any of them have names on them. People perhaps who were hobos, people who no one knew who they were when they died, that sort of thing. And there's just a handful of these there on North Orange Street. This is right next to, and you can see the Jewish cemetery in the background. If you know your biblical history, you'll remember that after Judas betrayed Christ, he was buried in a potter's field, and the money that he had been given was used to purchase his plot there. There's other kinds of cemeteries as well. This is a boot hill cemetery. These are a quick makeshift graveyard, usually for men who had been shot or hanged with their boots on, and that's how you get the name boot hill cemeteries. Usually wooden markers like this one. Particularly common in the West on hilltops, and often these wood, because of the dryness of the West, some of the wood markers have lasted 100 years and they're in very, very good condition. There are other kinds of cemeteries as well. There's institutional cemeteries for prisoners, orphanages, psychiatric centers. For example, at Letchworth Village in Rockland County, there's a 2-acre cemetery with hundreds of T-shaped markers with only numbers on them, representing the people who've been there were 4,000 people at Letchworth Village at one time, so there's a lot of those kinds of people down there. More modern cemeteries, like this one pictured, are less unique, certainly more sterile, and there's less of a diversity that you saw than what you saw in those earlier ones. They were pretty in their own way, but not quite the same as say Laurel Grove or Hillside. Many new cemeteries will require that these stones be flat to the ground for ease of maintenance. They're less interested in what we leave behind as a monument. They are moving in the direction that our whole culture is moving towards this mass culture and very simple kinds of things. And also, in more recent years, cremation has become more and more an idea. So you see these very large mausoleums and buildings where people are placed, or their ashes are placed after they die. Just to, before you go out this weekend and start looking at old cemeteries, historic cemeteries and graveyards, just a couple things to keep in the back of your mind. Firstly, many graveyards and cemeteries have rules. The ones in New England in particular, this is the old Sleepy Hollow graveyard down on the other side of the Hudson River, are very simple and very strong. In this case, rubbings and impressions are prohibited. That's something you need to know. Sometimes these kinds of graveyards have guided tours. Some will not allow you to take pictures, some will. Laurel Grove Cemetery here in Port Jervis, for example, has no rules about rubbings on monuments. So you need to check that to be careful if you plan to make a rubbing off of a monument or take a photograph of one. The other thing is you want to be very careful as you walk around these graveyards and cemeteries. Obviously, during summer, poison ivy is a problem, and in this case, as you can see in this picture, collapsed coffins are dangerous. This is a coffin that's collapsed in the ground, and if you step in that hole, you might go down another foot because of the nature of the way coffins used to be built. You certainly don't want to lean on stones or go too near to leaning stones, and you certainly, I reluctantly tell you this, but it is inevitably a problem in graveyards and cemeteries, and that is the issue of snakes. They love places like this. They just think that's the greatest place to be. So you have to be careful of the snakes, and then also woodchuck holes, because if you stick your foot into one of those, you could certainly wind up with a broken leg or a broken ankle. So with that, I hope that you've enjoyed your tour through some of the historic cemeteries and graveyards in our area. It was a pleasure to be with you, and stay tuned to Access 8 because we'll have other programs in the future relating to the history of our area.